Well, let me just say, as I consumed all this information, first, this is one of those stories where I, of course, saw Dan Wetzel, um, ESPN reporter based out of Michigan. He was the first um, actual legit reporter I heard report on the story on Paul Feinbaum's show. You know what surprised me about Feinbaum, by the way? Like a Josh Pate, this is interesting now. And this lets you know who's working the phones and who's talking to people. Josh Pate, when he got on and did a live to discuss this, he was like, I've known about this for a while. And it's not necessarily like, oh, now you tell us, but it just shows like, hey, you can't report something that's not totally credible. This is such a huge deal. So, of course, he couldn't share it up until last night when it bubbles up. But and Dan Patrick said this morning he had heard a rumor. Adam Schefter had said he'd heard a rumor. Feinbaum was like totally blown away, which I was like, that's interesting. He had no clue. So it makes me wonder if he's just over there taking calls and just spitting fire on First Take now. I was like, that's interesting.
Screaming about Group of 5 schools.
Yeah, screaming about Group of 5 schools. Exactly. It's like maybe he doesn't talk to anybody outside of the SEC. I don't know, but I did find that interesting, and that was a bit of a chink in his armor. So, but the story made me so sad to the point where I started to get angry because I think that's like fear-based for me because I think I can understand how that happens to somebody. My first question to myself when something like this happens is like, could this happen to me? Would I be, because I think I'm dumb enough to do just about anything. But I like to think I have like things in my life, like standards and morals and friends. And like, ever since I got sober, right? I've talked about that ad nauseum, but that's a huge thread of this story for me. Like I have had enough people in my life that have almost served as like human guardrails because I talk to them all the time that I would like to think I wouldn't get into a situation like this. But as I answered to myself, when I truly asked myself that question, I have never been the head coach at Michigan, right? I don't know what it's like to hold a position of such massive power, right? Again, maybe as a friend of mine told me this morning, I'm definitely selling myself short. Like I would not do something like that, but I always like, look, I just do not judge. I don't, right? And then the fallout, just the details, right? Michigan reports late yesterday afternoon that he was being fired with cause, and an inappropriate relationship with a staff member. And they conducted an investigation going weeks back. This is according to Dan Wetzel at ESPN, but they had no credible evidence to move forward. And then over the last 24 to 36 hours, evidence surfaced that, left the school with irrefutable evidence to fire him for cause. As far as like a background, and I think it is interesting, like who is Sherrone Moore? Because I knew him as the Michigan assistant, but I also love when I get to call a game and I get to dive into who these people are. He just had another child this summer. He's got 3 daughters, I guess 2 twins that are one. There are 2 because there's twins. And obviously he's married. And after he was detained, after he was notified, he was let go. Apparently he went over to the place, went over to where the woman who he was having the affair with lived. And this is in Saline. I know this a little bit because that's like it's 2 miles from Ann Arbor, like where Michigan Stadium is. So it's right up the road. And I looked at it on Google Maps this morning. It looked like a nice like apartment complex almost, where there were like, a bunch of like let's say like a really nice Chipotle on the bottom and other retail stores, and you got apartments up top. So it sounds like he went to that location, forced his way in, and police were called for reports of an alleged assault. At that point, he was detained and then turned over to police in Pittsfield, because Pittsfield those are the police that, it's in like this Watchsaw County or something. I'm saying it wrong, but that county, Ann Arbor's in that county, right? So, 4 hours, and this guy ruined his life certainly in the immediate future, right? I mean, like, he is still in jail right now, and they're expecting him to appear in front of a judge. They don't know if that'll be like on Zoom or if that appearance will be in person. But I heard this reporter from Michigan, I think he was an AP guy or maybe a local newspaper guy there, but he was on Dan Patrick. Tony Garcia was his name, and he was standing at the courthouse talking to Dan. So, like, this story is still developing. The bottom line is Michigan has to find a coach, and we'll talk about that later in the show because I have some opinions on that and some feeling on that. It's just so, like, where we are as where college football is as a sport. Like, it's a little, and I think this is another thing that sort of frustrated me last night. Like, Kalen DeBoer is in the college football playoff, and his name is being kicked around as going to Michigan. Now, I know he coached at Eastern Michigan, was the head coach there, had great success, right? And then he's a proven winner, right, at Washington and everything he did there. But it's like he's got a job at one of the best jobs you could have in college football, but he would leave that to go to Michigan. So I'm like, okay, that was a destination job, I thought, and maybe it will be. Maybe this is all scuttlebutt, but this seems to have some real horsepower behind it. Then you look at, like, people this morning were talking about Matt Campbell. Matt Campbell just took the job at Penn State. Like, but now he would go to Michigan. And I don't know, maybe this has been going on forever, or maybe I'm just old and I'm getting, like, a little crusty, but it's like the lack of, like, any kind of commitment to any of these institutions or situations. And I get it. Like, these guys are eventually going to get fired, but I just feel like the way the players move and the way the coaches move, it is what it is, right? You got freedom of movement. It's the United States of America. There's collective bargaining and contracts and legal stuff that is, guys have to pay penalties if they leave early, or maybe somebody else has to buy them out. But at the end of the day, like, they're doing what they're, I guess, free to do under the law. But it like puts a sour taste in my mouth as a guy who likes the sport. And it goes back to what Heather Dinich said earlier this week, ESPN reporter, like, people may start to lose, like, there is, like, a little bit of, like, an undercurrent here where people are starting to lose interest in this a little bit because of all this stuff, like just how transactional it's becoming. Okay, so that's out of the way. I'm sure that's just me being old. But more on Sherrone Moore. High school, grows up in Kansas, right? Went to a junior college in Kansas. Then he went to play for Bob Stooks at Oklahoma. He was a guard there in 2007. Same staff as, like, Brett Venables. He was there for 2006, 2007. Started 14 games at guard. Gets a job at Louisville as a grad assistant in 2009. Steve Cragthorpe gets fired, but he stays on staff, and Charlie Strong actually gives him a full-time job as a tight ends coach and stays there for 6 years. 2014, or 5 years, he goes to Eastern Michigan, coaches for Dan Enos, and then Enos gets fired, and the same thing happens. He's retained by the new staff, which I think says something about this dude, right? Like, whether he's a great recruiter or just an overall great guy, what he did wasn't, obviously, I mean, again, we don't have, this is all alleged, but, like, that's not a real cool thing to do, like the affair and all that stuff, and the stuff and the aftermath. But, clearly he was forging some strong relationships, and people really thought a lot of him, obviously. So he's at Eastern Michigan for a while. He's their tight ends coach. Then he gets the job at Michigan working for Harbaugh. He goes to Michigan as a tight ends coach, does that job for about 3 years from 2018 to 2021. And then in 2021, he's named offensive coordinator and an O-line coach. He's co-offensive coordinator. Where, by the way, like, and I wasn't aware of this till this morning, he called the plays during their 2023 season when they won the national title. Like, he's the play caller, and also his offensive line. And we know this award just because we know college sports. And funny, like 2 years ago, they were talking about Baylor's offensive line being so good. But the Joe Moore Award is for the best offensive line in the country. Michigan won that twice under Sherrone Moore. Their O-line did. So he gets the job, right, with all the stuff with Harbaugh and the suspensions, and he's named head coach officially in 2024. And in 2 seasons, he's 16-8. This last year, it's 9-3. And, they lost a lot of games, or they won a lot of games by smaller margins than they probably should have. Like Purdue, Northwestern, they lost to Oklahoma early in the season. The Purdue and Northwestern games were just really close, closer than they should have been. And then they lose to Ohio State. But then you're 9-3 playing in the Big Ten. Like, that's a hell of a job. I mean, of course you want a little more, but Michigan, and if you think about it, they have been one of the more thoughtful, less hyperbolic institutions in the world of college sports. Like, Harbaugh took him like 6 years. This is the shortest tenure ever of a Michigan coach. And, that school, I'm never going to say there's less pressure, but because their athletic department is so dynamic and they're so good, they'll win a national championship in basketball. They'll compete for a national championship all across Olympic sports just about every year. And there's just not as much. It's hard to say that we undersell Michigan football, but you get what I mean. Like, it's just not as crazy as like in Alabama, right? Where it's like, people are at your house if you lose like 1 or 2 conference games. It's a good school. And I think they're a little more thoughtful and a little more patient. But there's obviously, there's no opportunity for patience in a situation like this if you're Michigan. And the fact that like this has been going on for such a long time, apparently this really started to gain some traction, like, again, like the underbelly of it, right around like in the fall, and it's such a bummer of a situation. And to think that, by the way, locally here in the Big 12, and in Central Texas, like this is weird to talk about this now, but from a football perspective, like there could be fallout for teams in the Big 12. You can look no further than Baylor. Right? Who was the 5-star that flipped, Scotty, to Michigan from Baylor?
4-star Jamarian Vincent.
Jamarian Vincent flipped right on signing day, pretty much. Hey, the guy went to Conley High School, like right up the road from Baylor. Does he go back to Baylor? I have no idea. But, a lot of times Michigan is such a powerhouse. When you're going to Michigan, you're going because it's Michigan. But apparently Sherrone Moore was doing something right. And, the human condition is an MFer, dude. It just is. And we talk about it on this show because of my experiences, like through sobriety. And I know what it's like to like fall apart and hit a bottom. We saw it with Mac Rhodes, and like the ripple effect is like crazy because, yesterday they've been referring to the College Football Playoff Committee as an absolute clown show. Right. I've heard a couple people use that term, which is like, okay, whatever. It's a little much. But when you think about the blueprint for that College Football Playoff Committee was laid out by the chair, Mac Rhodes, right? Well, Mac has his own personal transgressions that we're very familiar with here in Texas. And, he has to step away because of all kinds of stuff. And like the rumors are out of control, whether it was this or that, but it was the human condition that got him. And so Mac is out. They have to replace him with Hunter Yurachek. Right away, it seemed like they were swimming upstream after that happened. And then, you get this, what people feel like is a weak committee, but like it starts with Mac Rhodes and all that stuff. And now here we go, this thing with Sherrone Moore, which obviously culminated with a very dark scene at this woman's apartment where he had a knife. This is all reported by police now, police report. He had a knife, threatened to kill the woman and himself. This guy could get charged with attempted murder. Like that's how being, having been I was not ever like a hardcore journalist, but I did the morning news. And, when somebody charges into somebody's house with a knife and says they're going to kill them and themselves, that usually results in an attempted murder charge. So like, this is just the ugliest of ugly situations. And you think about the flaws that we have as humans, it's very, very real. And this is just like it's a jarring deal. And I think all the big outlets did a really nice job this morning with this. Just kind of like, Mike Greenberg made it very clear. Like he was like, there is so much out there and that we're just not that show. We're not going to get into all that. And we're going to learn more and more. I made the mistake of getting on Twitter and, just Googling Sherrone Moore's name. And there's other women stepping forward saying he slid in their DMs. Apparently, this woman was an administrative or executive assistant. Sounds like she was his assistant. So that is that's where this becomes more than an affair too. It becomes totally egregious. So that's the personal side of this. Anything develops, we'll get back with you on that, right? We'll continue to tell you what's going on with this story, but it's ugly. So we turn the page, right? We turn the page from an ugly situation to a celebration. And that's hard to do, but it's pretty easy when you got a couple guys who played for Army and Navy that are going to chat with us ahead of the Army-Navy game, the 126th meeting between Army and Navy, coming up this weekend at M&T Bank Stadium in Baltimore, 3:30 Eastern time on CBS. Friend of the show, Gary Danielson, will be on the call with Brad Nessler. We will be back with two guys who know way more about this rivalry and the celebration that is Army-Navy coming up after the break. The Pete Souza Show is presented by Slovak.